The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Copper Ridge as Sheriff Bill Carson walked his usual patrol route. At 80 years old, he moved with the careful grace of a man who had learned to respect his aging body while never backing down from his duties. The mining town buzzed with its typical morning activity, as human settlers prepared for another day of extracting precious metals from the rocky ground beneath their feet. Carson had been the law in Copper Ridge for over 30 years. He had watched the small settlement grow from a handful of prefab shelters into a thriving community of nearly 3,000 souls. The town sat on the edge of human space, where the familiar gave way to the unknown and dangerous. Here humans lived alongside traders and workers from dozens of alien species, all drawn by the promise of wealth hidden in the planet's mineral-rich soil. The sheriff adjusted his worn leather holster as he passed the central marketplace. Vendors from across the galaxy hawked their wares to anyone with credits to spend. He nodded to familiar faces and kept a watchful eye on the newcomers. Experience had taught him that trouble often arrived on the morning transport ships, dressed in the clothes of honest traders but carrying the intentions of thieves and murderers. A commotion near the shipping yards caught his attention. Raised voices carried across the morning air, speaking in the harsh clicking language of the Craxi. Carson frowned and quickened his pace. The Craxi were reptilian beings known throughout the sector for their violent temper and contempt for other species. They stood nearly 7 feet tall on powerful legs, with scaled hide that could turn aside most small-caliber weapons. Their yellow eyes held an intelligence that was both cunning and cruel. As Carson approached the source of the disturbance, he saw 3 Craxi surrounding a human dock worker. The man looked terrified as the aliens gestured aggressively and made threatening sounds. The largest of the 3 Craxi wore the elaborate scarring that marked him as a clan leader. Carson recognized him immediately as Vectar, a smuggler who had been operating in the system for several months. The sheriff had been building a case against Vectar for weeks. Reports of missing cargo, intimidated witnesses, and suspicious ship movements all pointed to a major criminal operation. But gathering solid evidence against someone as dangerous as Vectar required patience and careful work. Carson had learned long ago that rushing into confrontations with dangerous criminals often led to dead lawmen and free criminals. But watching the dock worker cower in fear made Carson's decision for him. He approached the group with the steady confidence that had kept him alive through 3 decades of frontier law enforcement. "Morning, Vectar," Carson said in a calm voice that carried clearly across the shipping yard. "Seems like you're having some kind of disagreement with one of our citizens." The large Craxi turned toward the sheriff with a look of amused contempt. His yellow eyes gleamed with malice as he sized up the elderly human who dared to interrupt his business. The other 2 Craxi moved to flank Carson, their clawed hands resting on the weapons at their sides. "Old human," Vectar said in accented but clear English, "this does not concern you. Walk away while you still can." Carson stood his ground, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "I'm afraid it does concern me, friend. This is my town and that man is under my protection. Now why don't you tell me what this is all about?" The dock worker took the opportunity to scurry away, leaving Carson alone with the 3 dangerous aliens. Vectar watched the human flee with obvious disappointment before turning his attention back to the sheriff. "Your protection means nothing here, old man," Vectar hissed. "We take what we want when we want it. Your human laws are words written on paper. Our laws are written in blood and fear." Carson had heard similar threats countless times over the years. Young punks, alien raiders, and corporate enforcers had all tried to intimidate him with talk of violence and death. Most of them were now either dead in prison or smart enough to avoid Copper Ridge entirely. "Well now," Carson said with a slight smile, "that's where you're wrong. See, I've got a warrant here for your arrest on charges of smuggling, theft, and conspiracy. You and your boys are going to come with me to the lockup while we sort this whole thing out." The sheriff's words hung in the air like a challenge. The morning sounds of the shipping yard seemed to fade as workers and traders sensed the tension building between the old lawman and the alien criminals. Some of the smarter ones began moving away from the confrontation, while others watched from what they hoped was a safe distance. Vectar's response was swift and brutal. The large Craxi moved with surprising speed for such a massive creature, his powerful arms swinging toward Carson's head. The sheriff had been expecting some kind of attack, but his 80-year-old reflexes were no match for alien speed and strength. The blow caught him across the side of his head and sent him staggering backward. Before Carson could recover his balance, the other two Craxi were on him. Powerful hands grabbed his arms and held him steady, while Vektar produced an energy whip from his belt. The weapon crackled with electric current as the Craxi leader smiled with cruel satisfaction. "Let me show you what Craxi law looks like." "Old human," Vektar snarled. The first lash of the energy whip sent fire across Carson's back and drew a grunt of pain from the tough old sheriff. The second and third strikes followed quickly, each one leaving burned flesh and the smell of scorched clothing. The aliens holding Carson's arms laughed as their leader delivered the punishment, enjoying the spectacle of human suffering. A crowd had gathered to watch the beating, but none of the onlookers dared to intervene. Vektar's reputation for violence was well known, and few beings in the sector were willing to risk his wrath by helping a single human lawman. After a dozen lashes, Vektar stepped back to admire his work. Carson hung between the two Craxi supporters, his shirt burned away and his back crisscrossed with painful welts. But his eyes still burned with defiance, and he met the alien leader's gaze without flinching. "This is what happens to humans who think they can tell the Craxi what to do," Vektar announced to the crowd. "Remember this lesson well." The three aliens released Carson and watched him collapse to the dusty ground. They walked away laughing, their point made clear to everyone who had witnessed the beating. The old sheriff lay motionless for several minutes before concerned citizens finally worked up the courage to approach and help him to the medical facility. The medical facility in Copper Ridge had seen its share of mining accidents and bar fights, but Dr. Helen Morris had never treated injuries quite like the ones covering Sheriff Carson's back. The energy whip burns formed a crosshatch pattern of charred flesh that would leave permanent scars, even with the best treatment available on the frontier world. "Hold still, Bill," Dr. Morris said as she applied healing gel to the worst of the wounds. "These burns go deeper than they look. You're lucky those Craxi didn't kill you." Carson gritted his teeth against the pain but remained silent as the doctor worked. His pride hurt worse than his injuries, though he would never admit it out loud. In 30 years of law enforcement, he had never been so thoroughly humiliated in front of the people he was sworn to protect. Word of the sheriff's beating spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. The story grew in the telling, with each version adding new details about the Craxi's cruelty and Carson's bravery. By evening, everyone in town knew that their respected lawman had been whipped like a common criminal and left bleeding in the dirt. The town's communication center buzzed with activity as news of the incident reached the colonial networks. Video recordings of the beating, captured by security cameras and personal devices, began making their way across the star systems. Within hours, the images of the elderly sheriff being tortured by alien criminals had reached Earth itself. In a military barracks on the war-torn planet of Kepler 442b, Major Pete Carson was cleaning his rifle when his communication device chimed with an emergency message. The Special Forces officer had been in the field for 6 weeks, leading surgical strikes against rebel positions in the planet's dense jungle terrain. His unit had earned a reputation for completing impossible missions with minimal casualties. Pete's hands stilled on his weapon as he read the message from his hometown. The dry military language couldn't hide the brutality of what had happened to his father. Attached video files showed the beating in painful detail, and Pete watched in growing fury as the Craxi whipped the old man who had raised him to believe in justice and honor. Captain Jake Carson received his notification while his Marine unit was boarding transport ships for another assault on enemy positions in the Vega sector. The 45-year-old officer had led more combat drops than any other Marine in his battalion, earning decorations for valor that filled a display case back on Earth. His men respected him for his tactical brilliance and his willingness to share their dangers. Jake read the message twice before the full meaning sank in. His father, the man who had taught him to stand up for what was right no matter the cost, had been publicly humiliated by alien thugs. The Marine captain's face darkened with rage as he watched the video, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his communication device. Lieutenant Commander Rick Carson was deep in enemy territory when his encrypted message arrived. The naval intelligence officer specialized in infiltration and information gathering, often spending months behind enemy lines gathering crucial data for military operations. His current mission involved tracking weapon shipments to rebel forces. But personal emergencies took priority over everything else. Rick found a secure location to view the message his handler had forwarded from Earth. The youngest of the Carson brothers had inherited his father's analytical mind along with his sense of justice. As he watched the Craxi leader deliver punishment to his elderly father, Rick's intelligence training kicked in and he began planning a response. All three brothers immediately requested emergency leave from their commanding officers. Military regulations normally required extensive paperwork and approval processes for personal leave, but the Carson name carried weight in the armed forces. Their father's reputation as a frontier lawman and their own distinguished service records opened doors that remained closed to ordinary soldiers. Pete Carson's commanding officer, Colonel Susan Wright, granted the leave request without hesitation. She had served with Pete for 5 years and knew that the steady Special Forces officer never asked for favors. If Pete Carson needed to go home, then he had good reason for the trip. Jake Carson's battalion commander was initially reluctant to lose his best Marine captain before a major operation, but one look at the video recordings changed his mind. Military tradition held that family honor was worth fighting for, and no officer worth his rank would stand between a son and justice for his father. Rick Carson simply disappeared from his current mission, leaving behind only a brief message that he would return when personal business was concluded. Naval intelligence officers were accustomed to operating without direct supervision, and Rick's handler knew better than to question the judgment of someone with his track record. The brothers had not been together in 5 years. Military service across different branches and multiple star systems had kept them scattered across human space, fighting separate wars for the same cause. They communicated regularly through family messages, but their last face-to-face meeting had been at their mother's funeral half a decade earlier. Jake was the first to arrive at Copper Ridge, his Marine transport dropping him at the local spaceport 18 hours after receiving the emergency message. The captain wore civilian clothes to avoid drawing attention, but his military bearing was impossible to disguise. He made his way directly to the medical facility where his father was recovering. Pete arrived 6 hours later aboard a Special Forces stealth ship that appeared on no official flight schedules. The Major had used old contacts and classified transportation to cross 3 star systems in record time. Like his brother, he wore civilian clothing that did little to hide his dangerous profession. Rick's arrival went unnoticed by most of the town's residents. The intelligence officer had ways of traveling that left no official records, and he preferred to observe situations before announcing his presence. He spent several hours gathering information about Vectar's operation before joining his brothers at their father's bedside. The reunion was subdued but emotional. Sheriff Carson looked older and frailer than any of his sons remembered, the energy whip burns serving as visible reminders of his vulnerability. But his mind remained sharp, and he briefed his sons on everything he knew about Vectar's criminal activities. He's been running weapons and worse through the system for months, Carson told his sons in a voice roughened by pain medication. Got contacts in the colonial government who look the other way for the right price. Local authorities won't touch him because they're scared of starting a diplomatic incident with the Craxi. Government, the 3 brothers, listened in silence as their father detailed the extent of Vectar's operations. Weapon smuggling, slave trading, and drug running were just the beginning. The Craxi leader had been systematically testing human resolve in the outer systems, using violence and intimidation to establish his dominance over weaker species. The man needs to be stopped, Carson concluded, but it has to be done legal and proper. I won't have my sons throwing away their careers over an old man's hurt pride. The brothers exchanged glances that carried years of shared understanding. They had grown up in their father's shadow, learning his lessons about justice and honor. But they had also learned harder lessons in the military about what happened when legal and proper methods failed to protect innocent people. None of them spoke their thoughts aloud, but all 3 Carson brothers were thinking the same thing. Sometimes justice required going beyond the law. The abandoned mining facility sat 20 kilometers outside Copper Ridge, its empty corridors and machinery providing perfect cover for 3 brothers who needed privacy to plan their next moves. Jake had secured the location using his military contacts, claiming it was needed for training exercises. The facility's isolation and sophisticated communication equipment made it an ideal base of operations. Rick spread detailed star charts across a metal table in what had once been the facility's command center. His intelligence training had taught him to gather information before taking action, and he had spent the previous day learning everything possible about Vektar's operation. The Kraxi leader was more dangerous and better connected than their father had realized. Vektar has been operating in this sector for 8 months, Rick explained to his brothers as he pointed to various locations on the charts. He started small with simple smuggling runs, but he's expanded into weapons trafficking and slave trading. His base of operations is here, in the Broken Rock asteroid field. Pete studied the tactical display with the eye of a professional soldier. The Special Forces major had planned and executed dozens of similar operations during his military career. But this mission carried personal stakes that made everything more complicated. "How many people is he holding?" Pete asked, his voice carrying the calm professionalism that had made him legendary among Special Operations forces. "Intelligence reports suggest at least 30 prisoners from various species," Rick replied. "Most are civilians who were grabbed during raids on isolated settlements. Some have been there for months." Jake examined the defensive positions around Vektar's asteroid base. The Marine captain's experience with assault operations told him that a direct attack would be extremely costly. The Kraxi had chosen their location well, with natural barriers and defensive installations that would make any frontal assault a bloody affair. "What about official channels?" Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Can't Colonial Command do something about this?" Rick shook his head grimly. The Kraxi government has officially disavowed Vektar's activities, but they're providing him with weapons and intelligence through back channels. Colonial Command is afraid that direct military action might start a wider conflict with the Kraxi Empire. The three brothers had grown up believing in the system their father represented. Law and order, justice and fairness, the idea that good people could count on their government to protect them from evil. Their military service had taught them that sometimes the system failed, and when it did, good soldiers had to make hard choices. "So we're on our own," Pete said, stating the obvious conclusion. "We've been in worse situations," Jake replied with a slight smile that reminded his brothers of their shared childhood adventures. Rick pulled up detailed scans of Vektar's asteroid base on his portable computer. The facility had been built inside a hollowed-out asteroid, with docking bays carved into the rock and defensive weapons mounted on the surface. It was a fortress that would challenge even a full military assault force. "The good news is that Vektar doesn't expect any serious opposition," Rick explained. "His security is designed to handle angry victims and small-time competitors, not a coordinated military operation. We have advantages he doesn't know about." Pete studied the base's layout with professional interest. His Special Forces training had prepared him for exactly this kind of mission, where small teams had to overcome superior numbers through speed, surprise, and superior tactics. "What's our timeline?" Pete asked. "How long before he moves the prisoners or abandons this base?" "Unknown," Rick admitted. "But intelligence suggests he's planning something big in the next few days. Multiple ship movements, increased communication traffic, and weapons shipments all point to a major operation." Jake had been quiet for several minutes, his tactical mind working through the various options available to them. As the oldest brother and most senior officer, he naturally assumed the role of mission commander, though his brother's expertise would be crucial for success. "We need to do this right," Jake said finally. "Not just for Dad, but for all the people Vektar has hurt and will hurt if we don't stop him. That means we plan this like a proper military operation, with backup plans and contingencies." The brothers spent the next several hours developing their strategy. Each man brought unique skills and experience to the planning process, creating an operation that combined the best elements of Marine assault tactics, Special Forces precision, and intelligence gathering techniques. Rick would handle the electronic warfare aspects of the mission, using his expertise to disable Vektar's communications and defensive systems. His naval intelligence training had given him access to sophisticated cyber warfare tools that could cripple enemy computer systems. Pete would lead the precision strike element, using his Special Forces background to infiltrate the base and neutralize key targets. His mission would be to secure the prisoners and eliminate enemy guards without raising general alarms. Jake would command the main assault force, bringing Marine tactics to bear against Vektar's remaining defenses. His job was to capture the Craxi leader alive and gather evidence of his criminal activities. The plan required coordination and timing that would challenge even experienced military units. But the Carson brothers had grown up together, learning to work as a team long before they joined the armed forces. They understood each other's strengths and weaknesses with an intimacy that no amount of training could duplicate. "We'll need equipment," Pete observed. "Military-grade weapons and gear that we can't exactly requisition through official channels." Jake smiled and activated his personal communication device. "I know some people who might be able to help with that. Former Marines who understand the importance of family honor." The next phase of their planning involved reaching out to old contacts and fellow veterans who shared their sense of justice. Military service created bonds that transcended rank and regulation, especially among soldiers who had faced combat together. Within hours, Jake had arranged for a shipment of surplus military equipment to be delivered to their temporary base. The gear included assault rifles, body armor, communication equipment, and explosive charges that would give them firepower comparable to a small military unit. Pete used his Special Forces contacts to acquire more specialized equipment. Stealth suits, electronic jamming devices, and non-lethal weapons for subduing guards without killing them. His reputation in the special operations community opened doors that remained closed to ordinary soldiers. Rick's intelligence network provided the most valuable resources of all. Detailed floor plans of Vectar's base, guard schedules, communication frequencies, and computer access codes that would allow him to penetrate the facility's electronic defenses. As the sun set over Copper Ridge, the three brothers finalized their preparations for the mission that would either bring justice to their father's attackers or end their military careers. They had moved beyond the point where legal consequences mattered, driven by loyalty to family and a moral code that demanded action when the system failed. "Dad won't approve of this," Rick observed as they conducted final equipment checks. "Dad doesn't have to know until it's over," Jake replied. "And by then, Vectar will be in custody and the prisoners will be free." Pete smiled grimly as he tested his assault rifle's targeting system. "Besides, the old man taught us that sometimes you have to break a few rules to do what's right." The three brothers had learned their father's lessons well, but they had also learned harder truths during their years of military service. Justice was not always served by following proper procedures, and sometimes good men had to make difficult choices to protect innocent people from evil. The Broken Rock asteroid field drifted in eternal silence through the void between stars, its countless chunks of stone and metal providing perfect cover for those who preferred to operate away from prying eyes. Vectar's fortress hung among the larger asteroids like a metallic spider in its web, bristling with weapons and sensors that had kept it safe from law enforcement for months. At precisely 0300 hours, Rick Carson initiated the first phase of the operation from his position aboard a modified cargo shuttle. The intelligence officer's fingers danced across his portable computer as he launched a series of cyber attacks against the fortress's electronic systems. Years of training in electronic warfare had prepared him for this moment. The first virus propagated through Vectar's communication network like a digital plague, corrupting data files and creating cascading system failures. Backup systems activated automatically, but Rick was ready for them with secondary attacks that exploited vulnerabilities he had identified during his reconnaissance. Within minutes, the fortress's long-range sensors began reporting false readings, while its communication arrays suffered mysterious malfunctions. The Craxi technicians who maintained the systems scrambled to identify the problems, but Rick's attacks had been designed to look like random equipment failures, rather than coordinated sabotage. "Communications are down," Rick reported over the secure frequency his brothers were monitoring. "Sensors are compromised but not completely offline. You have a narrow window before they realize what's happening." Pete Carson moved through the asteroid field like a ghost, his Special Forces training allowing him to navigate the dangerous debris field without triggering proximity alarms. The stealth suit he wore bent light around his body, making him nearly invisible against the star-filled background of space. His infiltration pod was a marvel of military engineering, designed to insert special operations teams into hostile territory without detection. Pete guided the small craft through the outer perimeter of Vectar's defenses, using his knowledge of Craxi sensor limitations to avoid detection. The pod came to rest against the fortress's hull in a maintenance area that Rick's intelligence had identified as lightly guarded. Pete attached magnetic anchors to secure his craft, before activating cutting tools that would slice through the armored plating without triggering internal alarms. Meanwhile, Jake Carson commanded the main assault force from the bridge of a captured Craxi freighter. The Marine captain had assembled a team of volunteers from among the military veterans living in Copper Ridge, men and women who understood the importance of family honor and frontier justice. The assault team included former Marines, retired soldiers, and even a few civilian miners who had suffered under Vectar's criminal activities. They were not professional military units, but they shared a common purpose that made them dangerous opponents for anyone who threatened their community. "Remember, we want Vectar alive," Jake reminded his team over the communication system. "Kill him, and we lose the evidence we need to shut down his entire operation. Everyone else is fair game if they resist, but prisoner safety is our top priority." Inside the fortress, Pete moved through maintenance corridors with the silent efficiency of a professional infiltrator. His suit's advanced sensors allowed him to track guard movements and avoid patrols as he made his way toward the prisoner holding area. The Craxi guards were lazy and overconfident, relying on their fortress's reputation and defensive systems to protect them from retaliation. They had never faced an enemy who combined human tactical flexibility with military-grade equipment and training. Pete's first target was a guard post that controlled access to the main detention area. Two Craxi warriors sat at their stations, watching entertainment programs instead of monitoring security feeds. The Special Forces officer approached from their blind spot, moving with the fluid grace of a predator stalking its prey. The first guard died without making a sound, Pete's combat knife sliding between armored plates to find vital organs. The second guard had time to look up in surprise before a silenced weapon ended his life with clinical efficiency. Pete dragged both bodies out of sight before proceeding deeper into the facility. Rick's cyber attacks reached their second phase as defensive systems throughout the fortress began experiencing coordinated failures. Automated turrets lost targeting data, while blast doors refused to respond to security commands. Emergency lighting flickered and died in key corridors, leaving sections of the facility in darkness. "Security systems are compromised," Rick reported. "Internal communications are fragmented and defensive weapons are operating at reduced efficiency. Initiate Phase 3 when ready." Jake acknowledged his brother's signal and ordered the assault force to begin their attack. The captured freighter accelerated toward Vectar's fortress, its transponder broadcasting false identification codes that Rick had programmed into the facility's computer systems. The fortress's external weapons attempted to engage the approaching vessel, but Rick's viruses had corrupted their targeting systems. Energy beams that should have vaporized the freighter instead fired wide of their target, scoring the hull but failing to stop the assault force. "Brace for impact," Jake ordered as his ship closed the final distance to the fortress's main docking bay. The Marine captain had timed the approach to coincide with Pete's infiltration and Rick's electronic warfare, creating maximum confusion among the defenders. The freighter slammed into the docking bay doors with enough force to tear through the armored barriers. Emergency systems sealed off the breach automatically, but Jake's assault team was already disembarking through the gap they had created. Marine training took over as Jake led his volunteers into combat against superior numbers. The defenders were better armed and more experienced fighters, but they had been caught completely off guard by the coordinated assault. Human tactical flexibility proved decisive in the narrow corridors of the fortress. While Craxi doctrine emphasized strength and direct confrontation, the assault team used speed and maneuverability to outflank their enemies and attack from unexpected directions. Pete reached the detention area as the sounds of battle echoed through the fortress corridors. The Special Forces officer moved quickly to secure the prisoners, many of whom were in poor condition after months of captivity. "Stay calm and follow my instructions," Pete told the frightened captives in several different languages. "We're here to get you out, but I need you to remain quiet and do exactly what I say." Among the prisoners were humans, centaurians, and members of several other species that Vectar had captured during his raids. Some were barely conscious from malnutrition and abuse, while others retained enough strength to help their weaker companions. Pete began moving the prisoners toward a secondary exit that Rick had identified during his reconnaissance. The route would take them away from the main battle and toward extraction points where they could be transferred to safety. The fortress shook under the impact of explosions. As Jake's assault team fought their way deeper into the facility, Craxi defenders fell back toward defensive positions, but human adaptability and superior tactics continued to give the attackers the advantage. Vectar is in the command center, Rick reported from his position outside the fortress. He's trying to restore communications and call for reinforcements. You need to reach him before he escapes. Jake acknowledged the intelligence update and led a squad of his best fighters toward the fortress's upper levels. The Marine captain moved with the confidence of a veteran combat leader, trusting his training and his team to overcome whatever obstacles they encountered. The battle for Vectar's fortress had begun in earnest, and the Carson brothers were proving that human determination and military expertise could overcome superior numbers and defensive advantages. But the most dangerous part of their mission still lay ahead. The command center of Vectar's fortress occupied the highest level of the converted asteroid, its armored walls lined with communication equipment and tactical displays that normally gave the Craxi leader complete control over his criminal empire. But Rick Carson's cyber attacks had turned the sophisticated electronics into worthless scrap, leaving Vectar isolated and desperate as human voices echoed through the corridors below. Jake Carson moved through the fortress with grim determination, his assault team clearing each level with methodical precision. The Marine captain's experience with urban combat served him well in the confusing maze of corridors and chambers that honeycombed the asteroid facility. Behind him, his volunteer fighters displayed the kind of courage that could only come from deeply personal motivation. These were not professional soldiers following orders, but ordinary people who had chosen to risk their lives for justice and the safety of their community. "Third level secure," reported Danny Walsh, a former Marine who had served under Jake during the Vega Sector campaigns. 12 Craxi down, no casualties on our side. These lizards fight hard, but they don't adapt well to changing tactics. Jake nodded grimly as he studied the tactical display on his portable computer. Rick's intelligence updates showed Vectar's remaining forces concentrated around the command center, making their final stand in the most defensible part of the facility. "Pete, what's your status?" Jake asked over the secure communication channel. "Prisoners are secure and moving toward Extraction Point Alpha," Pete replied from his position deep within the facility. 17 survivors, including 6 humans. "Some are in bad shape, but they'll make it if we get them medical attention soon." The Special Forces officer had encountered unexpected resistance while evacuating the prisoners, but his training and equipment had allowed him to overcome guards who were more accustomed to intimidating helpless captives than fighting trained soldiers. 3 levels below Jake's position, Pete guided his group of rescued prisoners through service corridors that led away from the main battle. The civilians moved slowly, weakened by months of poor treatment, but their determination to escape kept them going despite their physical limitations. Just a little further, Pete encouraged them in the universal English that served as a common language throughout human space. "My brother is handling the heavy fighting, while we get you to safety." Among the prisoners was a young human woman named Lisa Park, who had been captured during a raid on her family's mining operation 6 months earlier. She had watched Vectar's men kill her parents and siblings before dragging her away to serve as a slave in his operation. "Are you really going to stop him?" Lisa asked Pete as they paused to rest in a maintenance chamber. Vectar always said no one could touch him because the government was too afraid to act. Pete checked his weapon and scanned the corridor ahead before answering. "My family doesn't leave debts unpaid," he said simply. "Vectar hurt our father, and he's going to answer for that and everything else he's done." The young woman looked at Pete with a mixture of hope and disbelief. She had given up expecting rescue months ago, resigning herself to a life of slavery or death at the hands of her captors. The idea that someone had come for them seemed too good to be true. Back in the fortress's upper levels, Jake's assault team prepared for their final push toward the command center. Intelligence from Rick indicated that Vectar had approximately 20 guards remaining, all of them concentrated in defensive positions around his command post. "They're using standard Craxi defensive doctrine," Rick reported from his external position. "Overlapping fields of fire, heavy weapons at choke points, and backup positions if the first line fails. But their communication is still compromised, so they can't coordinate effectively." Jake studied the tactical situation with the analytical mind that had made him one of the Corps' most effective combat commanders. The Craxi position was strong, but it had weaknesses that human tactical flexibility could exploit. Danny, take half the team and approach from the service corridor on the east side, Jake ordered. Make noise and draw their attention while I take the rest through the main entrance. When they focus on your position, we'll hit them from behind. The plan required perfect timing and coordination, but Jake's volunteers had proven themselves capable of following complex instructions under fire. They moved into position with the quiet efficiency of experienced soldiers, even though most of them had been civilians just hours earlier. Vektar paced frantically around his command center as reports of the battle filtered through the compromised communication system. The Craxi leader had built his reputation on strength and intimidation, but he had never faced enemies who combined superior training with personal motivation for revenge. How many humans are attacking us? Vektar demanded of his communications officer, a nervous Craxi technician who was struggling to make sense of the contradictory reports coming from throughout the facility. Unknown, sir, the technician replied. Our sensors are malfunctioning and most of our guard posts have stopped reporting. It could be anywhere from a dozen to 100 attackers. Vektar snarled in frustration as he realized that his carefully constructed criminal empire was crumbling around him. He had underestimated human determination and tactical ability, assuming that the soft settlers of the frontier worlds would never dare to challenge his authority. First explosions shook the command center as Jake's diversionary force engaged the outer defensive perimeter. Craxi guards responded with heavy weapons fire, their natural aggression making them focus on the immediate threat rather than maintaining awareness of other possible attack routes. Jake led his main assault team through the fortress's central corridors, moving with the fluid grace of Marines who had perfected their craft through years of combat experience. They encountered scattered resistance from individual guards, but the defenders were too focused on the eastern approach to mount an effective response. Breach charges ready, reported Sarah Kim, a former explosive specialist who had volunteered for the mission after hearing about the sheriff's beating. On your command, Captain. Jake checked his chronometer and confirmed his team's positions before giving the final order. Execute breach in 3, 2, 1 mark. The shaped charges detonated simultaneously, blowing holes in the command center's armored walls and filling the chamber with smoke and debris. Jake's assault team moved through the breaches before the defenders could recover, their superior training and equipment giving them a decisive advantage in the confused close-quarters battle that followed. Craxi guards fell under precise fire from human weapons as Jake's team secured the command center with methodical efficiency. The Marine captain moved through the smoke and chaos with deadly purpose, searching for his primary target among the alien defenders. He found Vektar cowering behind an overturned communications console, the mighty Craxi leader reduced to a frightened criminal trying to avoid capture. The alien who had publicly humiliated an 80-year-old sheriff looked far less impressive when facing trained soldiers with personal reasons for wanting him alive. Hello, Vektar, Jake said as he approached the trapped Craxi with his weapon trained on the alien's center mass. I believe you know my father. The Craxi leader looked up at the human Marine with yellow eyes that reflected fear and desperate calculation. Vektar was searching for some way to escape or negotiate, but Jake's expression made it clear that the time for talk had passed. Surrender now and you live to stand trial, Jake continued in a voice that carried absolute authority. Resist and die here like the rest of your crew. Your choice. Vektar's hand moved slowly toward a concealed weapon, but Jake was ready for the treachery. The Marine captain's rifle barked once, the shot precisely placed to shatter the Craxi's weapon without killing him. Wrong choice, Jake observed as he zip-tied the wounded alien's hands behind his back. But you're still breathing, which is more than you deserve. The captured freighter that had served as Jake's assault vehicle now carried a very different cargo as it made its way back toward Copper Ridge. In the ship's modified cargo hold, 17 rescued prisoners received medical attention from volunteer medics while Vektar sat in restraints under heavy guard. The Craxi leader had maintained sullen silence since his capture, refusing to answer questions or acknowledge the humans who had destroyed his criminal empire. But the evidence of his crimes filled dozens of data storage devices that Rick had extracted from the fortress's computers before they completed its destruction. Pete Carson supervised the care of the rescued prisoners with the gentle efficiency of a soldier who had seen too much human suffering. The Special Forces officer had field medical training that allowed him to stabilize the worst cases until they could reach proper hospital facilities. Lisa Park, The young woman whose family had been murdered during Vektar's raids sat quietly in one corner of the cargo hold. She watched the bound Craxi leader with eyes that held years of pain and loss, but also something that might eventually become hope for the future. "Will there really be a trial?" she asked Pete as he checked her vital signs. "Or will he just disappear like powerful criminals always do?" Pete looked toward his oldest brother, who was coordinating the return journey from the ship's bridge. "Jake's been fighting for justice his whole career," Pete replied. "If he says there will be a trial, then Vektar will face judgment for what he's done." The return to Copper Ridge took 18 hours, during which time news of the rescue operation spread throughout the star system. Rick had released carefully edited recordings of the assault to major news networks, ensuring that the galaxy would know exactly what had happened to Vektar's criminal organization. Sheriff Bill Carson was waiting at the spaceport when his son's ship landed, despite doctors' orders to remain in bed for at least another week. The elderly lawman moved carefully because of his injuries, but his eyes were bright with pride as he watched his 3 boys emerge from the captured vessel. "Dad, you should be resting," Jake said as he approached his father with obvious concern. "I'll rest when this is finished properly," Carson replied with the stubborn tone his sons remembered from childhood. "Vektar is my arrest to make, not yours." The sheriff had spent the previous day preparing arrest warrants and formal charges based on the evidence his sons had provided. Colonial law required that proper procedures be followed, even when dealing with criminals who had shown no respect for legal process. Vektar was transferred from the ship under the watchful eyes of local law enforcement officers and colonial militia, members who had volunteered to provide security. The Craxi leader looked smaller and less threatening in restraints, but everyone involved understood that he remained dangerous until he was safely locked away. "Vektar of the Craxi clan Mordek," Sheriff Carson announced in a clear voice that carried across the crowded spaceport. "You are under arrest for smuggling, slave trading, assault on a peace officer, and conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to legal representation under colonial law." The formal arrest drew cheers from the assembled crowd, many of whom had suffered under Vektar's criminal activities. For months, the alien had seemed untouchable, protected by fear and corrupt officials who valued peace over justice. Dr. Helen Morris supervised the transfer of rescued prisoners to Copper Ridge's medical facility, where they would receive treatment for months of abuse and malnutrition. The physician worked with quiet efficiency, but her eyes showed deep anger at the evidence of Vektar's cruelty. 17 people, she told Jake as they watched the last stretcher disappear into the medical facility. Some of them have been prisoners for over a year. That monster was selling them to other criminal organizations throughout the sector. Jake nodded grimly as he considered the full scope of Vektar's operation. The data Rick had recovered showed connections to criminal networks spanning dozens of star systems, with the Craxi leader serving as a key coordinator for slave trafficking and weapon smuggling. "The trial will expose all of it," Jake promised the doctor. "Every corrupt official, every criminal contact, every atrocity committed in the name of profit." Vektar's organization is finished. The legal proceedings that followed attracted attention from across human space and beyond. Colonial authorities had initially been reluctant to pursue such a high-profile case, but public pressure and overwhelming evidence made prosecution inevitable. Rick Carson testified as an expert witness, presenting detailed analysis of Vektar's criminal network and its connections to corrupt officials throughout the sector. His intelligence background gave weight to his testimony, and his presentation left no doubt about the scope of the Craxi leader's crimes. Pete Carson described the conditions he had found in Vektar's prison facility, his calm recitation of facts making the horror even more powerful than emotional testimony might have been. The Special Forces officer's reputation for honesty and precision made his words carry tremendous impact. With the judges, Jake Carson testified about the assault on the fortress and the capture of Vektar himself. The Marine captain presented the operation as a legal citizen's arrest, carried out under colonial emergency statutes, emphasizing that every effort had been made to minimize casualties and preserve evidence. The trial lasted 3 weeks, during which time news networks throughout human space carried daily reports on the proceedings. The case became a symbol of human determination to protect their communities from those who would prey on the innocent. Vektar's defense attorneys, provided by the colonial government to ensure fair proceedings, argued that their client was merely a businessman, caught up in circumstances beyond his control. They claimed that the assault on his facility was illegal and that evidence gathered during the raid should be excluded, but the testimonies of rescued prisoners destroyed any pretense that Vektar was an innocent victim. Lisa Park took the stand to describe the murder of her family and her months of slavery, her quiet dignity making her words more powerful than any prosecutor's argument. The judges deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Vektar was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Additional charges would be filed as investigators continued to uncover the full extent of his criminal network. Sheriff Carson stood in the courtroom as the sentence was announced, his sons beside him in a show of family unity that had become legendary throughout the sector. The elderly lawman's back still bore the scars of his encounter with Vektar, but his eyes held the satisfaction of a man who had seen justice properly served. The law won in the end, Carson told the news reporters who surrounded him after the trial. It took longer than it should have and required some unconventional methods, but justice was served according to proper legal procedures. The Carson brothers had achieved their goal through a combination of military expertise and careful attention to legal requirements. They had destroyed a criminal organization, rescued 17 prisoners, and ensured that Vektar would never again threaten innocent people. But more importantly, they had proven that human determination and family loyalty could overcome any obstacle when justice was at stake. The galaxy was learning that humans would go to extraordinary lengths to protect their own, and that lesson would echo throughout the stars for years to come. News of Vektar's capture and trial spread through the galactic communication networks like ripples in a pond, reaching every corner of known space within days of the verdict. The story of 3 human brothers who had destroyed a criminal empire to avenge their elderly father became the subject of countless news reports, documentary programs, and informal discussions among beings of every species. On the industrial world of Kepler 186f, Craxi workers in the orbital shipyards gathered around communication screens to watch footage of their former clan leader being led away in restraints. The sight of the mighty Vektar reduced to a common prisoner sent shockwaves through Craxi society, where strength and dominance were considered the highest virtues. How could 3 humans defeat an entire fortress? Asked Kexmil, a young Craxi engineer who had been following the trial proceedings. Vektar had 50 warriors and the best defensive technology credits could buy. His supervisor, an older Craxi named Torvus who had served in the Imperial military, studied the tactical reports with professional interest. They used coordination and planning instead of brute force, he explained. Human military doctrine emphasizes flexibility and teamwork over individual strength. The conversation was repeated throughout Craxi space as military leaders and criminal organizations struggled to understand how their species' reputation for invincibility had been shattered by a small group of human veterans. The implications went far beyond Vektar's personal downfall. In the neutral trading station of Babylon Point, which served as a crossroads for commerce between human and alien territories, the Carson brothers' story became a cautionary tale shared among criminal elements who had previously considered human settlements easy targets. Zefko, a Centaurian smuggler who had been planning raids on frontier mining colonies, canceled his operations after watching Rick Carson's testimony about intelligence gathering and cyber warfare capabilities. The idea that humans could track criminal activities across multiple star systems made traditional piracy seem far too dangerous. These humans are not the soft targets we believed them to be, Zefko told his crew as they reviewed their abandoned raid plans. If they can destroy Vektar's operation so completely, what chance do we have against their military forces? The smugglers' concerns were shared by criminal organizations throughout the sector. For years they had preyed on isolated human settlements, believing that colonial governments lacked the will and ability to pursue justice across interstellar distances. But the Carson brothers had proven that human determination transcended bureaucratic limitations. When legal channels failed, humans were willing to take extraordinary personal risks to protect their communities and punish those who threatened their families. Admiral Sarah Mackenzie of the Colonial Defense Force received daily intelligence reports about the changing attitudes among alien criminal groups. The career military officer had been concerned about escalating raids on human settlements, but those concerns were rapidly becoming obsolete. Pirate activity in the outer systems has dropped by 70% since the Vectar trial, reported Commander Liu Chen, her intelligence chief. Multiple criminal organizations have withdrawn from human space entirely, apparently deciding that the risks now outweigh the potential profits. Mackenzie nodded with satisfaction as she reviewed the tactical assessments. The Carson brothers had accomplished more with their single operation than months of official military patrols had achieved. Their message was clear and effective. Humans would respond to threats against their people with overwhelming force and unwavering determination. On the Craxi homeworld of Mordak Prime, government officials struggled to contain the political fallout from Vectar's trial. The clan leader's criminal activities had been an open secret within certain circles, but his public humiliation threatened to undermine Craxi claims of racial superiority. Foreign Minister Velkar addressed the Imperial Council with barely controlled rage as he described the diplomatic complications created by Vectar's downfall. "Our trading partners no longer fear us," he reported. "Human military capabilities have been significantly underestimated in our strategic planning." The council members listened in uncomfortable silence as evidence of human tactical superiority was presented in clinical detail. Rick Carson's cyber warfare had penetrated Craxi security systems that were supposed to be impregnable. Pete Carson's infiltration had bypassed defenses that had cost millions of credits to install. Jake Carson's assault had overwhelmed professional Craxi warriors with amateur volunteers. "What do you recommend?" asked war leader Bextar, whose own military reputation was built on victories against supposedly inferior species. "We avoid direct confrontation with human military forces," Velkar replied after a long pause, "and we ensure that no Craxi clan leaders operate in human space without explicit government authorization. The humans have demonstrated that they will pursue justice regardless of diplomatic consequences." The policy shift represented a fundamental change in Craxi attitudes toward humanity. For the first time in their species' history, they were acknowledging human military superiority and adjusting their behavior accordingly. Similar conversations were taking place in government chambers throughout the galaxy as alien leaders reassessed their understanding of human capabilities and determination. The Carson brothers had inadvertently conducted a demonstration of human military effectiveness that was more persuasive than any official diplomatic presentation. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a xenopsychologist studying interspecies relations at the University of New Geneva, published a research paper analyzing the galactic response to the Vectar incident. Her work became required reading for diplomats and military officers throughout human space. The Carson brothers' operation succeeded because it combined superior human tactical flexibility with deeply personal motivation, Rodriguez wrote. "Other species respect strength, but they fear the kind of focused determination that drives humans to pursue justice across interstellar distances." Her analysis identified the key elements that made human military culture so effective against alien opponents: individual initiative, team coordination, technological adaptability, and absolute loyalty to family and community created a combination that few species could match or counter. The research also noted that alien criminal organizations were rapidly developing new strategies to avoid confrontation with human settlements. Rather than viewing frontier colonies as easy targets, they now treated human space as a dangerous area to be avoided whenever possible. Captain Frank Morrison of the merchant vessel Liberty Bell reported typical examples of this changing attitude during his regular trading runs through the Outer Rim territories. "Used to be you'd see pirate ships every few systems," he told reporters at Starport 7. "Now, they scatter the moment they detect human transponder codes." The psychological impact of the Carson brothers' success extended far beyond its immediate tactical results. They had demonstrated that humans would not tolerate threats to their communities, regardless of the political or diplomatic complications involved. Sheriff Bill Carson recovered fully from his injuries and returned to his duties with renewed authority and respect. The elderly lawman's public beating had been intended to demonstrate human weakness, but the response it provoked had instead showcased human strength in its most dangerous form. "I never asked my boys to risk their careers for an old man's pride," Carson told a gathering of law enforcement officers from across the sector. "But I'm proud of what they accomplished, and I hope other criminals learned the lesson Vectar taught them." The lesson was indeed being learned throughout the galaxy, as alien governments and criminal organizations alike adjusted their policies to account for human determination and military effectiveness. The Carson brothers had inadvertently conducted the most successful demonstration of human power in decades. 6 months after Vektar's conviction, the galaxy had settled into a new equilibrium where human space was treated with a respect that bordered on reverence. The Carson brothers had returned to their respective military duties, but their names were spoken in hushed tones throughout alien territories, where their operation had become the stuff of legend. Captain Jake Carson stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Yorktown as his Marine battalion prepared for another deployment to the contested Rigel system. The 45-year-old officer had been promoted to colonel following his unofficial, but highly effective operation against Vektar's fortress, though his superiors were careful to maintain that the promotion was based purely on his regular military service. "Sir, we're receiving surrender offers from 3 different pirate groups operating in the target area," reported Major Collins, Jake's operations officer. "Apparently they'd rather negotiate with Colonial Command than risk facing your Marines in combat." Jake smiled grimly as he reviewed the tactical displays showing enemy positions throughout the system. Word of his tactical brilliance had spread among criminal organizations, creating a psychological advantage that was almost as valuable as superior firepower. "Tell them we'll accept their surrender if they provide complete intelligence about their operations and turn over any prisoners they're holding," Jake replied. "But make it clear that this is a one-time offer. Anyone we have to hunt down won't get a second chance." The psychological warfare aspect of his reputation had become as important as his actual combat capabilities. Criminal leaders who might have fought to the death against ordinary military units were now willing to surrender rather than face the legendary Marine officer who had destroyed Vektar's empire. Major Pete Carson was conducting a training exercise with his Special Forces team on the jungle world of Kepler 442b when he received a priority communication from Sector Command. The message contained intelligence about a slave trading operation that was threatening to destabilize 3 star systems. "Looks like we're getting another priority mission," Pete told his team as he studied the briefings. "High-value targets operating out of a fortified position with civilian hostages and time pressure. Sound familiar?" Sergeant Williams, Pete's senior non-commissioned officer, grinned as he checked his equipment. "Just like old times, sir. Except now the bad guys know who we are before we show up." The Special Forces team had developed a reputation for impossible rescues and precision strikes that surpassed even their previous legendary status. Enemy forces often abandoned their positions when they learned that Pete Carson's unit was being deployed against them. But the psychological advantage came with increased responsibility. Pete's superiors were now assigning his team to the most difficult missions in human space, confident that his tactical expertise and growing reputation would ensure success where other units might fail. Lieutenant Commander Rick Carson sat in a nondescript office on the intelligence station orbiting Proxima Centauri, analyzing data streams from across the galaxy. His cyber warfare expertise had been in high demand since the Vektar operation, with alien governments quietly requesting his assistance in tracking criminal networks that threatened interspecies commerce. "The hegemony is offering another consulting contract," reported Agent Martinez, Rick's handler within naval intelligence. "They want our help tracking weapon smugglers who are operating in their border territories." Rick studied the contract details with professional interest. 6 months ago, alien governments had been reluctant to acknowledge human intelligence capabilities. Now they were actively seeking human assistance with their most serious security problems. "Accept the contract," Rick decided, "but make sure they understand that any intelligence we gather will be shared with Colonial Command. We're not mercenaries for hire." The consulting requests had become so numerous that Naval Intelligence was considering establishing a separate division to handle alien cooperation agreements. Rick's success against Vektar's network had demonstrated capabilities that made human intelligence services extremely valuable to former rivals. Back on Copper Ridge, Sheriff Bill Carson continued his daily patrols with renewed energy and authority. The 80-year-old lawman's scars had healed, but they served as visible reminders of the price of underestimating human determination and family loyalty. The town had grown significantly since the Vektar incident, with new settlers drawn by the security and stability that came from living under the protection of the legendary Carson family. Mining operations had expanded, trade routes had been established, and Copper Ridge was rapidly becoming one of the most prosperous settlements in the sector. "Morning, Sheriff," called out Marcus Webb, a former Marine who had settled in Copper Ridge after completing his military service. "Everything quiet today?" Carson nodded as he continued his patrol. "Been quiet for months now," he replied. "Seems like word has gotten around that this town isn't a good place for troublemakers." The crime rate in Copper Ridge had dropped to nearly zero following the trial. More importantly, crime throughout the entire sector had declined dramatically as criminal organizations avoided any operations that might bring them to the attention of the Carson family. Lisa Park had recovered from her ordeal and was now working as a counselor for other survivors of Vectar's criminal network. The young woman's quiet strength and personal experience made her uniquely qualified to help other victims rebuild their lives after months or years of captivity. "The important thing to remember is that justice was served," she told a support group of fellow survivors. "The people who hurt us faced consequences for their actions, and their organization was completely destroyed. We survived, and they lost everything." Her work had attracted attention from victim advocacy groups throughout human space, where her story had become a symbol of hope for those who had suffered under alien criminal organizations. The fact that ordinary humans had risked everything to rescue complete strangers resonated with people who had previously felt abandoned by their governments. Dr. Elena Rodriguez published a follow-up study on the long-term effects of the Carson brothers' operation, documenting how their success had fundamentally altered interspecies relations throughout the galaxy. Her research showed that human settlements were now among the safest places in known space. The Carson incident created a deterrent effect that extends far beyond its immediate tactical results, Rodriguez wrote. Criminal organizations now assume that any attack on human civilians will provoke a military response that transcends normal governmental limitations. The study also documented how alien governments had begun incorporating human tactical doctrines into their own military training programs. The combination of individual initiative, team coordination, and technological adaptability that the Carson brothers had demonstrated was being studied and emulated throughout the galaxy. Admiral Sarah Mackenzie briefed the Colonial Council on the strategic implications of the changing security environment. "For the first time in decades, our frontier settlements are safer than our core worlds," she reported. "Criminal activity has shifted away from human space entirely." The Admiral's assessment reflected a fundamental shift in galactic power dynamics. Humanity's reputation for protecting its citizens had become a strategic asset that was almost as valuable as their military technology and economic resources. But the Carson brothers remained focused on their individual duties rather than their growing legend. They communicated regularly through family messages, sharing news about their respective assignments and their father's continued good health. "The important thing is that Dad is safe and the people of Copper Ridge can sleep peacefully," Jake wrote in his latest message to his brothers. "Everything else is just military politics and media attention." Pete's response reflected the same perspective. "We did what needed to be done for family and community. The fact that it had larger implications doesn't change our motivation or our responsibilities." Rick's analysis was characteristically thorough. "The operation succeeded beyond our tactical objectives, but the real victory is that other families won't have to go through what we experienced. Fear is a powerful deterrent when it's properly applied." Sheriff Bill Carson read his son's messages with the pride of a father who had raised men capable of making difficult decisions and accepting responsibility for their consequences. The elderly lawman's greatest satisfaction came not from their growing fame, but from knowing that they remained guided by the values he had taught them. As the sun set over Copper Ridge, Sheriff Carson completed his evening patrol of the peaceful town. The streets were safe, the citizens were prosperous, and criminals throughout the galaxy had learned to respect the consequences of threatening human families. The Carson brothers had accomplished something that military strategists and diplomatic experts had considered impossible. They had created peace through strength, deterrence through demonstrated capability, and security through the willingness to pursue justice regardless of personal cost. Their legend would continue to grow in the telling, but the brothers themselves remained focused on their duties and their family. They had proven that humans would go to any length to protect their own,